Good evening, everybody, and welcome. My name is Trey Grayson. I'm the director of the Institute of Politics, and I want to welcome everybody to the John F. Kennedy Jr. Forum, to tonight's forum. Tonight we're going to talk about Iran, Afghanistan, transatlantic relations, and a whole lot of other topics with our fabulous panel. The forum tonight would not happen without the co-sponsorship of the Future of Diplomacy Project and the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs. Tonight's forum is going to be moderated by Nick Burns, the Professor of Practice of Diplomacy in International Politics, and as Graham Allison once said, the finest diplomat in the United States of his generation. So please join me in welcoming Nick, and he'll introduce the rest of the panel.
Thanks, Trey. Trey, thank you, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure to be with you. What Trey didn't mention is that he's really happy today because his Kentucky Wildcats are NCAA basketball championships. So congratulations to Kentucky. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure for me to introduce to you Javier Solana and David Miliband. I'll say a word about both of them in a minute, but I wanted to say this is Europe Week at Harvard University and the Kennedy School because we have two of the senior politicians and international figures in Europe with us for the entire week. So they're in our classrooms. In fact, Javier was in both of my classes today. David will be in my classes on Thursday. Both of them are giving master classes in diplomacy, Iran, Afghanistan, so they're meeting lots of our students. In fact, they're having dinner, I think, with our European students this evening, so we couldn't be happier that they're Fisher Fellows in our Future Diplomacy Project for the entire week. We're going to have a wide-ranging discussion tonight. We want to talk about the future of the transatlantic relationship, Iran, how to end the war in Afghanistan. We want to ask them about how to begin to revive the Middle East talks between the Palestinians and Israelis. And finally, I want to ask them, as they're both friends of America and observers of America, about the United States and our power and where we should be heading in 2012 or 13. Let me introduce both of them to you. Javier Solana, to my left, is certainly one of the senior European leaders of our time and his time. He was, as you all know, the European Union's High Representative for Common Foreign and Security Policy. In other words, I can say this, he was essentially the Foreign Minister for Europe and the European Union, Secretary General of the Council of the European Union. He dealt with every major international issue. He was the EU's representative in the Middle East talks between Israel and the Palestinians, the Quartet. If we had gotten to negotiations with Iran, and we tried mightily in 2006 and 2007, he would have led us, and he would have represented the United States, Russia, China, and the EU in talks to limit and prevent Iran from becoming a nuclear weapons power. He is a senior figure. He has broad experience. He was Secretary General of NATO at the time of the Kosovo War. He led NATO in defending 1 million Kosovar ethnic Albanian Muslims who were in danger of being expelled from the country by Slobodan Milosevic. Before that, he was Minister of Foreign Affairs for Spain. He is a trained physicist. He is currently president of the Esad Business School Center for Global Economics and Geopolitics. He's a distinguished senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. He is the honorary president of the Center for Human Dialogue. He's a senior visiting professor at the London School of Economics. He's a member of the International Crisis Group. He is not retired. He doesn't believe in it. He's one of the most active people I know and a founder of Aspen España recently. So Javier, welcome. It's a pleasure to have you with us. David Miliband, to my left, I think is one of the most impressive and brightest of the young political leaders in Europe. I think he has a great future in European politics and in his own country's politics. He's a member of Parliament, Labour Party for South Shields. A lot of you know him because he was Secretary of State for Foreign and Commonwealth Affairs, the UK Foreign Minister between 2007 and 2010. In that position, he was a very influential leader, I think internationally, on the Iran problem, and we worked together on that problem. A leader on Afghanistan, and I would say a truth teller on Afghanistan. He came here to Boston about 1.5 years ago and gave a very important speech at the Kennedy Library on what we had to do to correct the deficiencies of our policies in Afghanistan, and a leading proponent of human rights. He was Secretary of State for the Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, and he led the climate change bill in the United Kingdom, a path-breaking bill. Before that, Minister of State for Communities and Local Government in 2005. Before that, Cabinet Affairs Minister in 2005. 2004, schools minister in 2002, elected to Parliament in 2001, and in the first term of Tony Blair's government, the Labour government, between 1997 and 2001, he was head of the policy unit at number 10 Downing Street, and in opposition between 94 and 97, head of Tony Blair's policy efforts. So he's had a meteoric rise in British politics. We have not heard the last, not by any means, from David Miliband. He was educated at Oxford, at Corpus Christi, and he made a great decision to come here to Cambridge, Massachusetts as a Kennedy Scholar, unfortunately at MIT, but he did very well there, and we're very pleased to have both of them here on this stage. So for the next 40 minutes, we're going to ask Javier and David to go through these 6 big issues rather quickly, because then we'll get to questions from you, comments from you, and there'll be, I hope, plenty of time for that before we conclude at around 7:25. So gentlemen, Javier and David, first question. You both served at the highest levels of international politics, and you were leaders of the transatlantic community, both committed to NATO. Can NATO and the transatlantic community, Canada, the United States, all the European countries, continue to succeed at a time of real economic crisis and political uncertainty? Or have we seen the best days of the transatlantic community? Or will we see a continued relevance of that community in global affairs? Javier, if we could start with you.
Well, first of all, let me thank Nick for your kind words. And it's a great pleasure for me to be back at Harvard and the Kennedy School. But let me remind you, or remind some of you, that the last time I was here, not the last, one before last, 2003, I had in the audience a student that happens to be today the Foreign Minister of Serbia. Vuk Jeremic was here in the audience. Yeah. Okay, let's go to the present. Well, the answer that you have to your question is yes. I think that it will continue. It will continue to be strong. It should be. But I think for that we have to do several things. The United States and also the European Union. I think that in the times of turbulence that you have described, more important than ever probably is to have a solid relationship between loyal friends and loyal allies. But again, I do think that you have to rethink your relationship with us, and we have to rethink our relationship with you. The European Union is going through difficulties. The United States has also its problems. And we have to come out of this situation, of this crisis, we will, and restart a new conversation to get the same the values that we defend, but in a manner that is adapted to the new realities of the world, a world in which power has been shifting around. And I think it will be very important to maintain this relationship. As far as NATO is concerned, I'm sure they will continue to exist. I think that the meeting that will take place in Chicago in the coming days, in the coming months, it will be an important one, and it will define a new strategic concept and many other things. I know that Nick has been working on that for some period of these last months. And I would like to advise, if I can, that one of the most important things that NATO has to do is to construct a deeper relationship with Russia. I think that for me, that would be the most important challenge that we have in front of us.
Thank you.
I mean, I think the case for European nations and the United States to work together remains very, very strong. We have very strong shared values. I think we also have some strong shared interests. But I think we should look for change rather than continuity in the relationship and how it operates. NATO was founded with a very clear, you might call it, geopolitical foe, a geopolitical foe who is no longer the main geopolitical foe, without wishing to stray into your politics. That project finished with the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Soviet Union. And I think we're still in the post-Cold War phase of thinking about NATO's role and about the transatlantic alliance. We know that we'd moved from post-Cold War to something definitive and clear if, when the United States had announced its pivot last year, we had pivoted together.
Our pivot to Asia.
Yeah.
Yeah.
A transatlantic alliance that was really working in unison and with great clarity would have pivoted together, because the truth is we both have to pivot towards Asia. It's not just the United States that confronts a different shaped world, so do the countries of Europe. I think that it's also worth just a coda to that. The United States needs Europe to step up in a very big way. We need to step up in terms of the way we engage with our own neighborhood, including our North African neighborhood, but not only that. And until the European Union is able to fashion a stronger and more coherent view of its own foreign policy, I think the United States is going to struggle to find us the kind of partner that we need to be.
And one of the crises that we worked on together, the three of us, with a lot of other people in 2007 and 2008, was the Iran issue. How do we prevent Iran from becoming a nuclear weapons power? How do we overcome the historical differences between my country and Iran and yours as well? And the construct that we fashioned on then is the same framework that will guide the talks that will begin on Friday, April 13th, when Javier's successor, Cathy Ashton, leads all the countries into nuclear negotiations with Iran. We want a diplomatic solution. We want to emphasize diplomacy. It is backed by sanctions and the threat of force, at least from the United States and some other countries. Is that the right framework to deal with the Iran issue? And do you both believe that diplomacy can succeed and we can avoid war?
You ask me.
Please.
I have a long experience of dealing with Iran and failing with Iran. It doesn't mean that we will have to fail. I think we have opportunities in the period of time in which I represented the international community, in which, to my mind, looking from here back, we had at least two moments in which we could have done some progress. That two moments were lost, not because of our responsibility, but at the end because of a referendum that took place, a referendum by the supreme leader of Iran, something that we had agreed it could not continue. I do think that it's possible to do it with this triangle that you have mentioned. But it seems to me that we will not be able to get a solution, negotiate a solution, unless we get engaged really in the debate, in the negotiation, really in the negotiations. Remember that the United States only participated in one of the thousands of hundreds of meetings that I had, only the last one. Burns, not this Burns, the other Burns, was representing the United States, only once. Now it's going to be in all the meetings. So you have really a much more powerful representation with Iran, number one. Number two, I think that we have to deal with Iranians accepting that they have rights, and they have rights under the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And those rights, we cannot start by denying them. We may have agreements at the end that will be de facto a diminishing of the rights that you have by the Non-Proliferation Treaty. But I think it will be a mistake to restart again, asking at the beginning of the negotiation what eventually we want to get at the end.
So Iran has a right to civil nuclear power, but certainly not to nuclear weapons, that distinction, right? David?
Javier did a remarkable job in trying to lead on this dossier, but I think he undersells himself a bit. One of the things I think it's really important for the students here to understand is that there's a massive difference in diplomacy between failure and not succeeding. It's not the same thing.
Yeah.
And on the Iran dossier, Javier did not succeed, but he did not fail.
Right.
If you accept that diplomacy has failed, then you are committing yourself to a very dangerous course because you are then embracing a non-diplomatic option. Javier did not succeed, but that doesn't mean that he can't succeed or his successor cannot succeed. It's the most fiendishly difficult country to negotiate with. It's very strongly internally divided. The supreme leader lives in the shadows and no one really knows what and how he thinks. The burden of history lies very strongly not just on its shoulders but in its head and in the head of its people. Which means that you can never say to an Iranian, let bygones be bygones. They live through their history, and of course the regime itself is increasingly distant from its own people, failing its own people. And in 2009, the emergence of a new actor on the stage, which was the Iranian people themselves, actually got in the way of the outreach that President Obama was leading at the time to the Iranian government. I think the twin track of pressure and engagement is right. Iran will never do what you want just if you offer them incentives, And it will never do what you want if you just offer them sticks. You have to offer both. I think that the most difficult question for the negotiators, there are two difficult questions, both of which we discussed in the class yesterday. One is, how do you balance the narrow nuclear question of how Iran fulfills its responsibilities while exercising its rights on the nuclear issue? How do you balance that issue with the wider regional question of how Iran, a Shia state and a Shia power, is going to live within a predominantly Sunni Middle East? And that tension between the narrow global nuclear question and the wider regional set of issues seems to me to be the first difficulty. The second most difficult question is about the sequencing of the discussion on the nuclear issue. And how do the questions are, I mean, at the most obvious level, do you start by discussing Iran's responsibilities, or do you start by discussing Iran's rights? And from that moment, you've got a whole series of very difficult sequencing questions. And the real challenge, I would say, for the next 18 months is for the talks not to collapse. If in 18 months' time the talks are substantive and real and ongoing, that will be a great success, not least because I think in circumstances of ongoing talks, it's very hard for Israel, which is the obvious third party in this, to exercise a unilateral military option. Right. And that's very important.
So two quick follow-ups on Iran. This is such an important issue, and I think we'll have lots of questions on it. President Obama, about 3 weeks ago, made the clearest statements to date of his presidency on his Iran policy. He said that he did not believe in containment, that he wanted to prevent Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons. He wasn't willing to live with a nuclear-armed Iran. He said he was willing to use force under certain circumstances. He said he had Israel's back. He effectively, as I saw it, tacked to the center, closer to the Israeli position. But he did one other thing in the 3 or 4 days surrounding the AIPAC conference. He made an impassioned plea for time and space for diplomacy. It was one of the strongest statements I've heard him make in foreign policy. He said, we've got to exhaust diplomacy. Was that helpful, do you think, in maybe inviting a more open and cooperative Iranian response at the beginning of these talks, or is it just too hard to tell?
I don't think you should see the President Obama's speech and his actions in terms of how close he is or is not to Israel. There is absolute alignment, it seems to me, between not just the US and Israel, but between European countries and Israel, and actually, if you push them, the Russians and the Chinese. Iran will not become a nuclear weapons state. That alignment is very clear, and I think it's a mistake to start judging the speech in terms of whether or not he moved towards Israel or not. What he did was he reframed the Iran question in a very significant way. For the first time ever, the red line has been very clearly painted, namely Iran will not become a nuclear weapon state, and the trigger for military action has been very clearly set out, namely if it becomes a nuclear weapon state, I will take it out, he said. So no one should be in any doubt, whether you're in Iran or elsewhere, about America's determination to make sure that it doesn't become a nuclear weapon state, but equally, America's determination to pursue every conceivable option until there is no alternative to a military option. And I think that the lack of clarity about that has bedeviled diplomacy up till now. I think the insertion or the assertion of clarity in the speech and in the Atlantic interview are very significant. But I don't think it's about whether or not he's close to Israel or not. It's not a bilateral dispute between Iran and Israel. It's a dispute in which Israel has a very significant stake, but it's not a bilateral dispute. It's a global question, not just a bilateral question.
But you can understand for the United States, it's very important that we have an identity of views with Israel, and there has been a separation, I think, between Prime Minister Netanyahu and President Obama. But Javier, what are your views on this?
I think that the question of Iran is not bilateral or trilateral, as David has said. It's a multilateral problem. Iran with nuclear weapons is a problem to everybody, to Saudi Arabia, to Egypt, to many countries which are close and others which are far away. The important thing to my mind now is to really see how we can handle the bilateral, the multilateral negotiation, and at the same time take into consideration the evolution in the region. Syria is going to be a very important part of the negotiation. if Syria at the end of the day comes out in a situation that breaks with Iran, the situation will be completely different for the negotiations. So I think we have to follow at the same time the bilateral negotiation with them by the international community, and at the same time watching very carefully the evolution in the region.
If Cathy Ashton, your successor, is able, with all the other countries and Iran, to keep these negotiations going for the next several months, are we effectively in a diplomatic period where there's very little chance of the use of force by Israel?
Well, I think that if we start a negotiation, and during the process of negotiations, I think will be a tremendous mistake to do anything else. If we are negotiating, we are negotiating. And we have to give time to negotiation. It's absurd to think that in 3 months we are going to have a solution to the problem that lasts for many, many years back. So if anybody thinks that the negotiators are going to resolve the problem in a question of months, 2 or 3 months, I think there's a mistake. We better not start. We have to give sufficient time to really be able to make the points and to get the possibility to give a chance to real negotiation. It will be very difficult, very, very difficult. The mistrust is very profound, and we have to let the negotiators space and time.
Let me just come in on that, because I'm sure someone will ask, let me anticipate a question, which is, isn't there a danger that if we start advertising that this is going to take a long time, that the Iranians will play for time,
Right. Play out the clock.
enrich like crazy while the clock ticks,
Yeah.
and actually leave the international community, including Israel, in a very, very difficult position? I think that's a very, very good question, and there needs to be both leverage and patience. Patience alone will induce the Iranians to make a fatal miscalculation, which is that they can simply string this out. So there's got to be leverage as well as patience, because if there isn't, then I think we'll end up in a very dangerous situation.
So we'll see both diplomacy and also sanctions continue and not so subtle pressure, is what you're saying.
Yeah, and I think that the starting point for the discussion has got to be making, and the fact that the Chinese and the Russians are there as well means that the preparations are incredibly important. Yeah. The Iranians have got to understand that they can end up exhausting the space they've got to find a diplomatic solution. And that, I think, is one of the advantages of what the president has done. Equally, he's said, don't rush to war. I often hear people talking about a strike on Iranian military installations or nuclear installations. This is incredibly dangerous. It makes it sound like sort of taking out an appendix or something. What we're talking about is a series of strikes with a series of responses, which, if you wargame them through, involve very significant risk of wider conflagration. So I think what we are talking about is whether or not you want to have a war with Iran, not a strike on Iran.
Right.
And that, I think, dramatizes the stakes that are at issue in this set of talks.
Thank you. This is very helpful. I'm confident we'll come back to Iran in the question and answer period. We have been in Afghanistan, Britain and the United States, fighting for 10.5 years. NATO joined that effort in 2003. For a long time, our belief was that we could win, in essence, with the Afghan government, a conventional victory, that the Taliban wouldn't return. We've been disabused of that. And now I think it's clear to everybody there is no conventional victory. So the question I want to ask both of you is, where does this war end? And does it end in a negotiation between the Afghan government, the Taliban, the regional countries surrounding Afghanistan, and some of the other great powers like China and the United States? Is that what it's going to take to bring all of our troops home at some point? Because I frankly can't even see the horizon for a total withdrawal of American troops. Javier.
Well, I think that when we talk about Afghanistan, the temptation is to analyze the past and to say how many mistakes we have made, etc. I would not enter into that, but we have to recognize that we have made a tremendous number of mistakes in dealing with Afghanistan. Now, supposedly that we are at the situation that we are today, with the President Karzai, with the capacity that he has today, with negotiation, we still do not know exactly what is going on publicly with the Taliban. There's rumors, but we don't know exactly, at least I don't know exactly what is the situation, which I'm pretty sure there will not be a manner in which we leave Afghanistan in a dignified manner without an agreement with the regional powers. I mean, there are countries in the region that has much more interest in the stability of Afghanistan than us. And we have to give them the chance to do it and to help in that direction. I mean, at the end, Tajikistan and China and India and Pakistan, they have much more interest in the stability of Afghanistan than we do. So without an agreement with these countries in the way of leaving, it will be very difficult to really live in a dignified manner, because we're left behind a mess bigger than the one we found. So really, I claimed a long time back that a global, regional conference or a regional scheme should be put in place a long time back, I think. By the way, that would have been another manner of dealing with Iran, with another door.
Right. It could be an entree.
Remember that in Bonn, when we started in Bonn, at the beginning of the conflict with Afghanistan, we had at the table Iran.
We did.
In Geneva, we had at the table Iran. So it's a big.
I don't know how many of you read the Boston Globe today. On the front page, there's a picture of a boy who's lost his father in Afghanistan. He's an American boy. His father did something incredibly brave to save an Afghan child and got killed in the process. The only time I ever see Afghanistan getting reported is when soldiers get killed. It's become the forgotten war. And for you, you've got 120,000 troops there. Mm-hmm. We've got 10,000 troops there. And the scope for the West to leave with enormous damage, both to its reputation and to its interests, is very, very real. And I think we're at a very perilous moment, because we're almost reaching the stage when so many of the players there have given up on us that they're just waiting for us to leave, and we're on the slipway to a very, very undignified and dangerous exit. What do we know? We know that you can't kill your way out of a counterinsurgency. We know that no government in Afghanistan's history has ever governed the country from Kabul. We know that the state in Afghanistan will never have a monopoly on violence in that country. We also know that it is a country of 40,000 villages and valleys with enormous diversity, from Herat in the west on the Iranian border up to Mazar-e Sharif in the north, round to Kandahar and Helmand in the south and east. And so that says to me that we have to get a negotiator sanctioned by the UN Security Council, drawn from the Muslim world, appointed now to talk to all sides on two tracks. One, internally, all the tribes need to be in the solution. And remember, the insurgency, if you talk to Michael Semple here, who knows more about this than anybody else, there are at least 9 different branches to the insurgency. It's not just the Taliban. There are 9 different parts of it. But you've got to talk to all of the different factions in the country for an internal political settlement. And the tragedy is that in Bonn in 2001-2, the vanquished were kept out of the peace conference, so-called. Secondly, you need, as Javier said, a regional side to this, because all of the ethnic groups in Afghanistan cross borders. It was one of my predecessors who drew the line, 2,500 kilometers between Afghanistan and Pakistan. A long time ago. Well, not that long, 1919, 1920. And Bertrand Russell said that anything after 1900 was family history. So not that long ago. And all of right around the country, there are these groups that cross the border. And let me just say one other thing. Pakistan is absolutely key to the future of South Asia. And this is a South Asian crisis, not just an Afghan crisis. I think it's important. I'm just looking around the room, I can see there are people here from South Asia, probably people from Pakistan as well. The most dangerous thing I ever hear when I come to the United States or click onto your newspapers is people saying America would be better off if it cut its links with Pakistan. That would be an absolute disaster. I mean, the only thing worse than continuing to have basically a military relationship with Pakistan where you give them F-16s is to cut off completely. And Pakistan's tragedy is that for 30 of the last 62, 63 years since independence, it's had a military regime. It needs friends in the West who are supporting its economic and social and political development, not cutting off from it. And that is actually the heart of the geostrategic challenge we continue to face from Al-Qaeda.
So the problem that the international governments have is that, mic's not working, thank you. The problem that we have internationally is that the U.S. is trying to negotiate with the Taliban, and yet we've announced a withdrawal of NATO forces by 2014. And so is the Taliban simply going to wait us out and continue to fight a military battle after the preponderance of European forces leave?
Well, the answer to that is yes, but they would have done that even if you hadn't announced a date. I mean, the tragedy at the moment is that we've got an end date, but not an end strategy. An end date, but not an end game. And the sooner we get an end game, the better, because fewer people will get killed in the interim, both Afghans and Western forces. Now, my own view is, remember, the Taliban want us out, and we want to get out. So there is actually some common ground to work on. It's important to go back to basics in this. And in the end, it's not Afghanistan that is the geostrategic, explosive country there. It's Pakistan that is. And so I think that the West should be very clear about what its bottom lines are. And the bottom line is that Afghanistan will not become an incubator for global jihad again. And there are bottom lines in respect of some of the social progress that's been made, although, frankly, some of it is honored more in the breach than in the observance. But nonetheless, there has been some progress on girls' education and things like that. But frankly, we're going to just have to set out our minimum bottom lines. Others will set out theirs. And the truth is, with only 18 months or 2 years of combat operations to go, we've got declining leverage to assert those. But the sooner we start a serious negotiation where you try and find common ground, the better.
And Javier, the other difficulty is that the United States actually is going to stay after the Europeans leave. We've got to train the Afghan National Army and be present, not on the streets, but on bases for counter-terror operations on the border. So we're not leaving. How is this all going to play out? How do you look at this?
Well, I think what is leaving is probably NATO, which I think is the moment in which it has to leave. And the United States may stay, and therefore the Europeans and the Canadians will leave. Some of them are already leaving. So I think it will be better to get the decision that NATO leaves and the American, after the 2000X, whatever is the date that is placed. But I agree with David that we don't have an exit strategy, although we have repeated thousands of times that we had one, but we don't have it. And if we do have it, we have not put it to work. I think that it's time to get the regional conference in place, appoint somebody, give him the support, because we appointed somebody. And remember that we had a very good UN representative there that failed because of the lack of support by everybody. So I think that this is very important to do it very rapidly. 2014 is tomorrow.
But look, you're going to have to also do some very painful things. I mean, at the moment, there are a series of night raids against Taliban, taking people out who are then replaced. One of the absolute basics to get any kind of confidence, and they've set up this office in Qatar, is the deal is we'll stop the night raids if they stop the roadside bombs. That's a very difficult thing to say and do, but it's essential. Because unless you're able to build that kind of I don't like to call it a confidence-building measure. It's actually a life preservation measure for our troops, and then you're never going to get beyond this shooting war, which you can't win. I mean, remember, every single person in the US and British military is now trained to say and believe that there is no military solution in a counterinsurgency. I mean, David Petraeus said to me the first time I ever went to Iraq, we can't kill our way out of this problem. And he's right. But the logical corollary of that is you have to find a non-military solution. That doesn't mean you pull out all your troops tomorrow, because that would I think, create the conditions for an even worse civil war than there is at the moment. But we're going to have to do some very, very painful things, and part of the truth-telling is that that is better than having more stories like you've got on the front of the Boston Globe today.
Okay, we'll come back to this as well. Two more quick questions before we go to questions from the audience. One is on Europe and one's on the United States. You're both European leaders. You've come through the worst economic crisis in the history of the Eurozone. It has spawned a political debate about the organization of Europe, the future of a united Europe. Are we going to have to see, will you have to produce in Europe, a stronger Europe in Brussels relative to the member states to provide a structure for the Eurozone to be able to succeed in the future? Am I right or wrong about that? And how is the debate going, as you see it?
Well, from my point of view, you are right. I think the outcome of this crisis in the European Union cannot be any other direction than more integration. That doesn't mean that the nation state is going to lose all the prerogative in the integration. But there's no doubt that without that the solution of this problem can be done without more integration. Therefore, the question of sovereignty is a question that we have to think about. That sovereignty is goes back to Westphalia. I mean, it's impossible to run the world of today or to live in the world of today with the concept of nation-state as used in Westphalia. Therefore, giving sovereignty is something which is going to be normal. And in fact, we do it every day. We don't recognize that, but when we get an agreement in WTO, we give some sovereignty away. But we have to do that much more clearly in the European Union. I don't see any other way out than more integration. I'm sorry, David may not agree with me, but the British and the Europeans sometimes we do not agree on some issues.
Look, the economics all points in one direction, which is in respect of the Eurozone, which you asked about. 17 members of the Eurozone, 27 members of the European Union. The economics all points towards closer integration within the Eurozone. However, the politics all points in the opposite direction. Because not just in Britain, but elsewhere, there is a strong feeling of desire for a looser set of arrangements, both in creditor and in debtor countries. Now, I think it's inevitable that you're going to have a tighter union within the Eurozone. I don't welcome the fact that that's going to mean Britain is further sidelined, but I think that's the consequence. I don't think that's good for Europe, but I think that's going to happen. And the danger is that the Eurozone turns inwards, doesn't just become tighter. It turns inwards on trade policy, it turns inwards on a series of other reforms that are going to be very, very important. Now, Spain is suffering 50% youth unemployment. What's extraordinary is that there isn't more revolt about what they're the austerity that they are going through. But the government that's replaced the one that Javier supported is implementing a completely suicidal economic policy. I mean, they're in the middle of a desperate recession, and they're slashing public spending to the tune of 3.5–4% of GDP. And they're going to end up in a situation where they come from bailout after bailout, but austerity on its own is not an economic policy, as you have shown in this country by having a much more sensible short-term approach to management of demand. If you haven't got any demand in your economy, you've got no growth. If you've got no growth, you can't reduce your deficit.
But David, the question was posed to us, I think, is that the outcome will be more integration or less integration. I disagree with you. I think on the conclusion you draw from the statement that you make, you said that you will welcome more economic integration. But at the same time, you see less political integration. My point is that this is impossible. The moment you get more economic integration, you will have to be followed by more political integration.
Yeah, I didn't express
and
myself.
That is the only way. This is the only manner that has been always and continue to be. It's impossible to have more economic integration and not integrate politically, because you have to talk about taxes, you have to talk so many things which are strictly political, and you have to really go into the political side, also integrating much more.
No, Javier, let me put it this way. The economics points towards more integration, but the politics pulls towards less. That's the point I'm making. Not that somehow you can have more economic integration without more political
But
integration.
in this push and pull has to win both in integration.
But what's interesting and odd is that the country that Germany is standing in the way of the economic integration that is essential. I mean, the story of the last 2 years has been of the German government standing in the way of euro bonds, closer confederation within the Eurozone. That's the truth of the last 2 years. And the problem has gone from being a 50 billion euro problem to being a 1.5 trillion euro problem. That's actually what's happened. So it's not that we disagree on what economic integration means, it's that the politics is inhibiting it.
I think it may be inhibited now, but the moment that this situation will evolve, it will evolve in a reasonable period of time, the economic integration will bring along the political integration. And that is a problem because we will have the Eurozone much more integrated than the European Union. And that is a problem for the relationship with a country like yours, for instance. And I understand that problem.
Let's come back to this in the Q&A. We have a lot of European students here this night. I know they'll ask about that. Final question. We had Secretary of State James A. Baker III here at Harvard last week. He's an extraordinarily impressive guy. He ran 5 presidential campaigns. He's a great political mind. He was also arguably our most successful Secretary of State of the last 30 years. One of the takeaways from his 10 hours with us here at Harvard was this. He's worried about the United States. He's worried about our governance. Worried about the ability of our 2 political parties to make very tough decisions about our economic future that would sustain American power in the world. You're both very close observers of the U.S., you're friends. Are you worried about us? Are you worried about America leading with purpose in the future?
Well, I'm worried about America because I like America.
Thank you.
And as an honest citizen from Europe, a global citizen, I think that the role of America in the global politics is fundamental for a long time to come. Therefore, when I see the polarization in the country, when I see a debate television, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, I don't know how many, because you have many debates, nonsensical, but many debates. And you talk about everything, with the exception of the problems that really matters today. It's something really very frustrating. This is the most important country in the world. It will continue to be. And the impression you give to an ordinary citizen of the world, after seeing the leaders of or parts of the leaders discussing things that have nothing to do with the solution of the economic crisis, etc., is really very, very troublesome. And if that is the type of United States we're going to see, so polarized, so unable to get to consensus, unable to look at the problems and resolve them in a reasonable period of time. Second thing I would like to say is that we have, in the world of today, in the complicated world of today, a political cycle, to my mind, which is too short. I mean, in a way, this political cycle in the world today is fixed by the political cycle in the United States. And after the first by-elections, after the president is elected, the whole thing changes. The Obama pre-congressman by-elections is different from the Obama 2 years, after that election. So everything is very complicated to handle. When other countries like China and India and Brazil are planning, are doing things with a much more capacity to have a time in their sides. I think that this is a big problem. The lack of capacity for consensus, the polarization. I hope that the polarization doesn't arrive also to the tribunal, to the Supreme Court, and also the time in which we handle problems at a rhythm that is not compatible with the level of problems that we have in a globalized world.
Well, it's a bit rich for Europeans to complain, given how brilliantly we're dealing with our own problems, to come and complain about how you're dealing with yours. But I think that I'd reframe the question as follows. America's position in the world is going to change dramatically in the next 30 years. As dramatically as when it was a rising power to take over from Britain as the world's superpower. And the world is going to have a different economic balance of power in 30 years' time. And that requires a process of adaptation that is very, very difficult for any nation to walk its way through. It's particularly difficult for a nation whose political system is designed to check executive power rather than facilitate it. So if you think about the wrenching changes that you need to make in your social security system, in your economic focus, you can think about it, in your energy infrastructure, in your oil dependence, etc. Your system of government isn't designed to facilitate those big shifts. And I think that's the governance challenge that you've got in a context where the relative balance of power is going to shift very, very profoundly in the next 30 years. And so it's not I don't know if it's a question about worried, because I think the rejuvenating capacities of this country are very, very strong indeed. But I think that there is that there's a frenetic gridlock at federal level that incapacitates you in a pretty profound way, and I think that's what you're going to have to think through.
Thank you. I wish we could continue this. We're going to go to questions. You know, usually talk of decline and collapse of empires takes place at Yale. I believe, and thank you for reframing it, I believe the United States will be the most significant power, global power, 30 years from now. But it all gets back to Baker's question, can we deal with our economic problems, because that's the source of our military and political power. It's a fascinating subject to discuss. I think we'll go to questions. We haven't addressed the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I'm sure someone will ask about it, including my friend Sid Topol, seated in the front row. But we've got microphones here on the floor and the aisleways. We've got microphones on the balconies here. So just a couple of words of advice. Please identify yourself. Let us know what you're studying if you're a student. And please make sure that your very brief, cogent question has a question mark attached to the end of it. Please.
My name is Ben Bolger, and I'm an alum of Harvard. I have a question. It's very clear that during the Cold War, there was a very clear focus for the purpose of NATO. In this kind of post-Cold War environment, it seems that the United States continues to be very economically involved in supporting NATO and also supporting the military infrastructure in NATO. Given our own country's economic woes, is it still appropriate for the United States to be as involved or over-involved in NATO, or should there be a rescaling of the balance?
Javier, you're a former Secretary
That is not
General.
a question for me, it's a question probably for you. Nick, I'm not going to define what is the involvement of the United States in NATO. I think that without an engagement of the United States in NATO, NATO probably will not exist. Now, how much should others put their shoulder also? Yes, and it's our obligation to do it. I'd like to use the terminology, to comment on the terminology that has been used when we talked about Libya, leading from the back, and others being on the front, but helping from the front to those who were leading from the back. So it's quite a confusion, okay? But without a leading of the United States, none of these operations would have been done.
I think you can scale back, because when Nick was U.S. ambassador to NATO, how many American troops were there in Germany?
Oh, there were probably at that time, I don't know, 50 or 60,000 American troops.
So there's room for massive shift, because the purpose of NATO has fundamentally changed. And NATO is much less concerned, obviously, for intra-European relations. Its relations with Russia is very important, but I don't see that as a military confrontation, anything like the same way.
No, not a military.
No, I know you're not saying that. You're saying it's about, and it's as much for the European Union as it is for NATO to fashion their relationship with Russia. So I think there can be a rebalancing. It should cost you less, but I still think it should be a useful instrument for you.
And I would just say thank you. This is a very good question. President Obama is going to host the NATO summit in Chicago on the third weekend of May. I think what he is saying, and I very much support him on this, is that NATO is in our absolute interest. We can't be isolationist, and we can't be unilateralists. We've got to be engaged. If we didn't have NATO, it sounds trite, we would have to invent it. Canada and 26 European allies all together, and we've seen how valuable it can be. But we're shouldering too much of the burden. And the Europeans are not spending as much on national defense as they should. And it's proper for the United States to keep on that issue and expect that Europe will be a more balanced partner. So thank you for that question. Joel.
Hi, my name's Joel Branald. I'm a grad student at the Kennedy School and a student of Professor Burns. Around the diplomatic circuit today, you hear the concept that time is running out for the two-state solution. Can you tell us when does the clock stop, and what happens next?
On the two-state solution, I think that the clock should not stop ever. I think the two-state solution is the only solution. When we talk about one-state solution, or those who talk about one-state solution, they don't want to solve the problem. And I think that a one-state solution will lead to many more problems than a two-state solution. Therefore, we have to put to work seriously, which we haven't done in a year, or over 2 years, and trying to bring peace within the two-state solution.
Joel knows I think this is the biggest diplomatic failure in 60 years. Joel did some extraordinary work with an organization called One Voice, which is a citizens movement in Israel and in Palestine, brings together Israelis and Palestinians to try to take action to build bridges between peoples, because the consent among the two peoples and the trust amongst the two peoples in the process has declined massively. And frankly, if you said to me, I want you to bet your mortgage on there being a two-state solution in your lifetime, I wouldn't want to do that. I wouldn't want to do that. Now, that doesn't mean we should give up trying, but it seems to me that it's not just enough to say, let's keep on with the same old, quote-unquote, peace process, because it's lost all credibility. It seems to me there are two conditions for getting this thing done. Remember, the Arabs rejected it in the 1940s. Israel's rejected it at different points in its history, so no one comes out of this smelling of roses. It seems to me there are two conditions to get this done. One is that this has got to be a regional settlement between Israel and the Arab world. It's not just about Israel and the Palestinians. Now, we're about to mark, I can't remember the exact date, the 10th anniversary of the Arab Peace Initiative, I think this month. Yeah. The Arab Peace Initiative was launched in Beirut in 2002, and it said all the countries of the Arab League will recognize Israel and establish diplomatic relations with Israel in the event that a Palestinian state is created. So it was about Israel having security within its neighborhood. And I think that's essential. The second is a much more tricky thing to say, but let me try and say it diplomatically. I think that if we expect America to be the sole midwife of this pregnancy, then it won't end well. You mentioned James Baker. Remember, the Madrid conference was an international effort, not just a US effort.
Javier was there. He was the host.
Were you the foreign minister at the time? Or the...
I was there, yeah.
So it seems to me that we have to regionalize the solution. It's an Israel-Arab solution, but we also have to internationalize the effort. Because, I mean, bluntly, American politics plays too big a role in the process if it's not an internationalized effort.
So,
let me say a word about the Arab Initiative. I was in Beirut at that time. I worked very hard with the Jordanian minister to write part of it. I think has a problem inside, which is all or nothing. The Arab Initiative should have the possibility of a step followed by a step. But it has to be the whole step for the whole recognition. And I think that makes the whole thing very unhelpful, because you have to resolve the problem in order to resolve the problem. And this is a petition of principle. So you have to, and this is what we tried to do in the last period of time, trying to convince both sides that they have to respond positively to any step taken by any of the two sides. And that will create the mechanism, the dynamics to go all the way to the end. Now, I agree that the peace process with the quartet in the classical manner, it will not be possible to be done. I said this afternoon, and you listened to me when I said it, that it will be impossible, on the other hand, to think that by leaving the two parties alone, they will find a solution. The unbalance of the two parties, once the occupiers, they are occupied, it's impossible that they can solve the problem alone. they will need some kind of help. That help should not come only from the United States, but the United States will be very, very important in relation with Israel. But the countries of the region, and in particular with the regional change, it should be a fundamental element also to create a catalytic effect.
Javier and I taught my class today, Modern Diplomacy, on this issue, the Israeli-Palestinian crisis. David will join that class on Thursday. Where we came out today, I'll just speak for the two of us. I think what the two of us came out were two things. One, that a two-state solution is vital and necessary. That Israelis and Palestinians must share the historic land of Palestine, and that a one-state solution would deny the Jewish basis of the state of Israel, and that is untenable for Israelis. They will not agree to it. And many of us, including myself, would never agree to that. Second is that the current peace process is not working. It's failed, as David has said, miserably. And that, David, you're right. The United States needs help from the European Union and certainly from the Arab world, and more vigorous Arab participation in reaching out to the Israelis and strengthening the Palestinians. So there's a long way to go here on a very complicated
Yeah, but you see,
subject.
look, think about this. I mean, I've always made the argument it's in Israel's interest for there to be a two-state solution, da, 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 da. But actually, if you're sitting in Tel Aviv at the moment, why do you think it's in your interest? I mean, your economy's booming. Your wall has reduced terrorist activity, bombings, etc. It's a very narrow strip of land, but the West Bank feels a long way away. Now, I say this with no sort of pleasure, but essentially the attempt to change the quote-unquote facts on the ground has been pretty successful. And it was an attempt, you can ascribe whatever motives you like to it, but I think that part of the issue is that the happy argument, look, it's in both sides' interests, is seriously doubted, certainly within Israel, by significant sections of the population, because they fear that the wrenching costs of change, including moving hundreds of thousands of their fellow citizens out of the occupied territories in the West Bank, isn't going to be worth the candle. So that's my fear. That's part of this loss of consent. I think one's got to look that pretty starkly in the face.
And I would say that Israelis need to reflect upon the fact that Palestinian rights cannot be denied forever. That there's a question of justice here for the Palestinians. I think that's the Israeli self-interest, to recognize that they cannot occupy the West Bank forever. It's not tenable.
Well, I mean, I make that argument. But in response, what the argument that comes in response is, yeah, but every time we pull out of territory, we end up getting rockets. And so people like you and me who want a two-state solution, we've got to think, what's the security? It's the security issue that at the moment is the trump card for the right in Israel. And we've got to think, what's the answer to that security conundrum? Because the narrative is, every time we pull out, things get worse.
Well, the United States has been a very good friend.
I disagree with
ahead.
that. I don't agree that every time that we pull out...
No, but that's the argument. I'm not saying I agree with it, but that's the argument.
But this is not an argument. It's a fact. Doesn't correspond to that argument. It's not an argument. It's a lie. And I don't think that this is a serious thing. I mean, that is not true. And I think, honestly, when you say, David, that somebody in Tel Aviv doesn't care, because he lives comfortably in Tel Aviv, he goes to the music and goes to the beach, etc., etc. I mean, this is a statement that is very complicated to accept. If you go to Kalkia, if you really close for every Israeli to see what is going on in the lines of crossing, if you don't see that, then you really are blind. And the people in Israel don't want the people of Israel to see that. And if you don't see that, you don't see anything. But the people and the Palestinians are suffering. If you go to Kalkilia and try to cross, I mean, I've done it walking. It's a big thing, big thing. And that happens to everybody, and to many people every day. I think we cannot diminish the case for the Palestinians, which have been. I think that the life of an Israelian, is valued many more times than the life of a Palestinian. And this is really unfair. We will never have a world in which I would like to live, where the life of a citizen of a country is more valuable, 10 times more valuable than the life of somebody.
David, last word.
Of course I agree with that. Of course I completely agree with that. The issue is not the passion with which we bring to the justice of the cause.
I didn't put any passion.
The question is what's actually happening on the ground. And one of the rules I have is there should be you should never have a discussion about Israel-Palestine without mentioning Gaza. Right? It's convenient not to mention Gaza. But the last time I went to Israel, I went to Gaza. I couldn't go as foreign minister for security reasons, but I went last time. Now, two things become very clear. One, the absolutely miserable lives that are being led there. It's a massive humanitarian issue. But there is a massive political issue as well, Javier. The massive change since 2002 is that Palestine is divided in an absolutely fundamental way. And remember, it's at the heart of the notion of a two-state solution. It's a contiguous landmass.
Okay.
Now, the Gaza thing, I think, is real. And whether we like it or not, the withdrawal from Gaza, which wasn't properly coordinated and wasn't properly done with the Palestinians, has led to a very powerful narrative within the Israeli psyche about what happens when land is withdrawn from. And if one neglects that in thinking about withdrawal from the West Bank, we're going to kid ourselves about what is politically sellable in Israel.
Javier, if we continue, this will occupy the entire evening. But let me, yes, just briefly. No, please.
Very briefly. We are going to have to deal with the Muslim brothers. Yes or no? Yes. They have come out of the election in Egypt. We have not gone through all these things, and at the end said that we are not going to deal with Egypt. Hamas will evolve by the Muslim brothers. Therefore, we'll have to deal with Hamas in a different manner than what we have left. We'll deal with them in the past, because they will evolve. The fact that they cannot be already in Syria is a very important, that they want to change and be somewhere else, because in Syria they are not like it, or they don't like to be in Syria. All these things are going to take place. And I think the moment of talking about Gaza and the West Bank, probably that will be a discussion that belongs to the past.
Okay, let's go. Thank you both for your candor and the depth of that discussion. Yes, please.
Hi, my name is Sherry Hakimi. I'm a second-year Master in Public Policy student here at HKS. Thank you both for joining us. With regards to the talks next week with Iran, between the P5+1 and Iran, some people are defining success as a concrete commitment from Iran regarding its nuclear energy program. Others are defining it as a commitment for another meeting. How would you define success?
Myself. Success for me is that Iran doesn't have a nuclear weapon.
No, but success for the next Friday's meeting.
After the next Friday's meeting, then it will be another. For me, that will be success.
David.
I agree.
So Sherry has done her second-year project, her PAE project, on this issue. Those were impossibly brief responses. What's your follow-up? You must have a follow-up question.
I actually would agree that the best commitment that you can ask for is another meeting. I would ask, what process would you recommend for High Representative Ashton to follow in these talks?
I would, well, she hasn't asked me anything, so I don't want to give recommendations, but I would recommend to be as tenacious as she's going to have a better help from the United States. They're going to be an important personality in the United States at the table. That will change also the game of the Iranians on some issues. First thing that. Second, I think we have to begin to create the conditions to understand what may be the end game. And not to say, well, we do not talk about anything until you stop and you undo what you have done. I think we have to begin preparing the ground to talk in a certain manner about what may be the end game. And provide this is a negotiation like any other. And we were close to do that, in two occasions. In one occasion was impossible because we didn't agree at the end, we ourselves, the group of the countries that I represented, and the other, the last one, because we agreed on something and then the supreme leader didn't agree. The last meeting that took place in Geneva was a success. And it became a non-success. I wouldn't say a failure, but a non-success.
Just briefly, you asked about process. I think that if I were Cathy Ashton, I would get each of the representatives of the 6 nations to say the same thing. The Iranians need to hear from the Russians and the Chinese, as well as from us, the same message. And it needs to be consistent between public and private. And if at the end of the meeting the Iranians go away thinking these guys have got their act together and they mean it, that will be quite an important preparatory stage. Because remember, one of the dangers is that we come out of the meeting and the Iranians say, well, we got different messages from the Chinese and the Russians and the Americans and the Brits. And that's a very dangerous situation.
Yes, please.
My name is Effie Michelle. I'm a first-year student here. Given U.S. spending cuts in defense and the ongoing financial crisis in Europe, what does the military balance for NATO look like in the next 5 to 10 years? Is it relying more on Southeast Asian capabilities, on Turkey, on the BRICS?
NATO?
NATO, yes.
No, I don't see NATO relying on the BRICS. That would be a contradiction, I think. No? They get to rely on the members of NATO, and among them is Turkey, no doubt about that, which is an important military force. But I think that one of the ideas that I had in mind, because I don't have in mind any longer because I cannot implement it, but is to take advantage of the crisis in order to get a better organization internally, the European Union, and military matters. We have enormous scope to do better on military capabilities. And somebody has to do it now, prepare now the ground for that, not wait until the crisis is over. This is the moment which we have to save, in a way, and we have to organize better our capabilities, and I think it's possible. We have the instruments to do that. We don't have the political will to do it, but we have the instruments to do it if the political will were there.
America spends more than the next 14 countries combined on its military spending. We're not short of hardware. There's plenty of waste, but NATO doesn't suffer from shortages. There is an issue about European defense spending. Defense Secretary Gates made this very powerful point at the end of his tenure of office. So there are, I think, bigger issues for the Europeans than there are for the Americans, but I don't think the military are cash-starved. And assuming that the Afghan war does wind down, then there are pretty big savings as well to be had.
The United States is spending over 4% of its GDP on national defense. I think all but 3 other NATO countries are spending below 2%. The largest European country, Germany, 1.1 or 2%. Doesn't Germany have a fundamental self-interest obligation to lead a revival of European defense capacity? Why should the Americans do all the work in NATO?
Yeah, I think, look, the German question is a historic question that's been posed over the centuries, and it's going to be posed again. And the irony is that the whole of Europe's asking for Germany to be stronger and more sort of tougher in its leadership role. So I think that is a big question. But it's for obvious reasons of history, there is a tendency for Germany to want to be harmless. And that leads it towards a view of security that's pretty minimalist, I would say.
I think that I don't know how many questions are left, but I would say something about Germany. I shouldn't, but I would say I think that Germany now has a fear, a concern about having to lead. And Germany is afraid of having the responsibility to lead. And that is the problem which we are living today. We need the leadership. They fear to have the leadership. And they have a big debate, internal debate, which has to do a lot with history and with I tell you a story which for me was fascinating. We were with a Chinese one day, and with a very young parliamentarian from the Bundestag, and with the Chinese, and I was there by chance. And he was asked, why do you don't act more dramatically, economically, etc., in the moment in which we are living? They said, my grandmother, what first said, I am 29 years of age. I am parliamentarian. I've never seen inflation in my life. I lived all my life without inflation. My grandmother told me that inflation was terrible. And I believe my grandmother. I have not changed a single inch, even if my experience in life has been the opposite. And this is, unfortunately, this is true still.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
Pleasure to be in such distinguished company. My name is Michael Kenyalian. I'm a student at Harvard Business School and formerly an Iran desk officer at the State Department. So I wanted to push the panel a little bit on the Iran issue. More specifically, you know, the bizarre foxtrot between Iran and the Western powers over the dual track approach has been persisting over the last decade and even a little bit longer. So do you believe that the political dynamics are such that a final deal could be struck with Iran at this time? And if not, what needs to change? Is it Khamenei? Is it the role of Russia and China in the global energy markets, et cetera?
I don't think it's going to be struck at this stage, if by that you mean now.
Within this process, under these political dynamics?
I don't think it'll happen this year, but is it a realistic ambition for a second Obama administration to see this issue resolved diplomatically? I would say yes. And that it's not about regime change, but it's about clarity, consistency, firm but not macho is the absolute key to dealing with Iran. And I think it is doable if you line up the economic, the political, and the regional. And it's the regional that's going to be the most difficult, I'm afraid. You may think that the nuclear question is tricky, but actually, in the formula of Iran asserting its rights but fulfilling its responsibilities, there is enough common ground. My biggest fear is about the regional relationships, because Iran is undoubtedly a source of regional destabilization, undoubtedly. But equally, there are a number of the Sunni Arab states, notably in the Gulf, who absolutely hate the Iranians with a vengeance that goes beyond geopolitics and, sorry to say it, goes to the heart of who's a real Muslim. And that is a very, very dangerous situation. But if you talk to anyone, if you talk to people in a number of the countries of the Gulf about how they view the Shia, they view them as second-class Muslims. And until we figure out a way through that, that puts the nuclear thing in a rather, it makes it seem rational.
And the consequences of that, what has been said, is that Iran has to choose between being a movement of the Shia or being in a state. If they decide to be in a state, you can deal with the state in a much better manner. We know how to deal with the state. If you have a movement that wants to occupy parts of Bahrain and parts of Kuwait and parts or mobilize those people and Hezbollah, etc., you want to keep on having influence by proxies. This is a completely different story. And that has to be clarified. I think that this, under the table, will be part of the discussion, of the conversation that we have to have with them.
Thank you for your question. I was the American negotiator of the sanctions resolutions against Iran between 2005 and early 2008. Here's what I fear. I fear we're not going to be patient enough, we, the Americans. You can see what's going to happen. This is going to be protracted, these negotiations, as David and Javier know. Very difficult. And, you know, if we go a month or two, I think many people in our society will say diplomacy can't work, we've got to turn to the military option. We Americans have to be very smart. We need to defeat the Iranians and their nuclear weapons ambitions, but we can only get there, I think, multilaterally, relying on our friends in Europe especially, but patience. That might mean staying at the diplomatic table long enough to get the job done, but as David has rightly said, not long enough in a naive way that Iran runs out the clock. where that balance is going to be very tricky for President Obama, and I really admire the fact he's willing to go into these conversations. We haven't had a sustained conversation with him on any issue in 30 years since the Jimmy Carter administration. That's how critical this moment is starting next Friday. That's a great question. Thank you. Yes, sir.
Hi, I'm Steve. I wanted to elaborate more on this Iran thing, but not from the standpoint that I've heard it brought up in these recent discussions. That I see more that it's not necessarily that they're going for a nuclear weapon, but that they're on the border of a very powerful nation, namely Russia. And I think that the real issue here is not necessarily that we fear they're going from 20% enriched uranium to 90 somehow in any short period of time, but that there is a financial system that's collapsing. The European Union is not in the worst crisis of the European Union, but the worst crisis of humankind, and it is collapsing. And I think that that is really the driver of these war pushes for Iran, for Syria, for now North Korea. I really don't think that this has anything to do with what we would really consider stopping a humanitarian crisis like we said in Libya, but really with creating a world war like how the Balkans were used in that similar fashion. And you look at what's happened in the Middle East since the Sykes-Picot, and it becomes pretty obvious that the role of the British Foreign Office in getting the United States tied up into these long and draining...
You're referring to the First World War.
Right.
Sykes-Picot, 1916.
Right.
So your question is there an international conspiracy of these great powers to get into war for economic reasons?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think everything's economic. From the way that it's pretty obvious that, our recent deployment of Michael McFaul as the ambassador to Russia, and his first words before even getting accepted were that he doesn't know anything about Pushkin or Russian diplomacy, but really he knows how to overthrow governments.
Okay.
I think that's pretty...
I think that's a complete distortion of Ambassador McFaul, but we got the drift of your question. Gentlemen, do you agree or disagree?
Without understanding everything, to tell you the truth, I tend to disagree more than to agree.
Look, you can't get 250,000 people to come and stand in minus 22 degrees temperature by being a professor of insubordination or whatever it was you said about Ambassador McFaul. I mean, the truth about the last 18 months in politics, whether in Russia or in the Arab world, is not about economics, it's about politics. And what you've seen in the last 18 months is politics coming back into the equation. And I think that is the most significant thing. What's happening, in my view, is that we're in the middle of an era of radical democratization, by which I don't just mean electoral democratization, but the democratization of relationships, not just between people, but between states. You're seeing an opening up that is revolutionizing access to information, and better education means that people can use that information. And so the bar of legitimacy for the exercise of power has been raised both in the undemocratic world and in the democratic world. And honestly, it would be lovely to think that Britain was as powerful as you suggest, but I fear that even the best brains of the Foreign Office can't manage the conspiracies that you've suggested.
Thank you for your question. Thank you very much. Yes, please. Right, sir?
Oh! I thought it was his turn next. So thank you first of all for being here. I really appreciate your company. And my name is Graham Moore. I'm the founder of a nonprofit that focuses on promoting investment in Somaliland, northern Somalia. And anyway, I just wanted to address and expand a little bit on your comment about how politics and reality can somehow push in very different directions. So I think that probably the biggest failure of American foreign policy has been the Manichaean worldview that policymakers and political leaders have promoted in our national discourse. I think it's really important to note that as we discuss Iran and Israel in this forum in Cambridge, Massachusetts, we have a national election going on in which Iran is being portrayed as a fanatical nation with regards to which the concepts of mutually assured destruction are completely irrelevant. This dialogue has a lot of parallels with the same kind of rhetoric that was used during Vietnam, when people discussed how the Vietnamese, because they were Buddhists, did not value life in the same way that we do. Oh, wait, I'm not finished.
Sir, could you just get to your question?
Yes,
That
I
would
can
help
get to
us.
my question.
We have 5 minutes left.
I think that our politics are concealing a lot of the truths about what our foreign policy goals should be and what they have been in the past. And my question is, what are America's real interests in foreign policy? I honestly don't think Afghanistan and Iran and Israel are worth a lot of the time they get. And as Alex DeWall pointed out in his recent op-ed, time and attention is a very scarce resource for policymakers. And the last thing I'd say is, how can we even discuss what America's interests are if we're not having an honest discussion about what America's values are and the impacts of our actions in the world over the past 4 decades?
Thank you very much.
Well, I think we are in a place where we discuss everything. This is an open university, good brains around the table, around the chairs, and I hope that everything can be discussed. So I don't see any reason why we have to put into question everything. We have places where we can discuss. I mean, we are doing today that. 2 foreigners are giving lessons to the United States here. So it's quite achievement. So God bless the Kennedy School.
2 points, just briefly. One, the question is about what's the bandwidth of politicians, and are we spending our time on the wrong things? It seems to me that in an interdependent world, which is what we live in, you've got foreign policy is about the global commons and about common problems. And the global commons is a security commons, an ecological commons, a financial and economic commons as well. The challenges are breaches to order. So actually I think that the stakes on the Non-Proliferation Treaty are high with the Iranian issue, and they deserve a lot of attention. The issue of Palestinian justice is a very big issue, and it's deserving, I would say, of more attention than it gets. So my fear is that it's the acute crises obscure the chronic ones. And the danger at the moment, actually, is that Israel-Palestine is too difficult to handle, so it doesn't get talked about at all. And that's the issue at the moment. Now, let me just mention, you mentioned Somaliland. It shouldn't be allowed to be lost completely. I mean, in the midst of the unspeakable difficulties in Somalia, there is a small part of Somalia, up in the northeast, Somaliland, which is pretty peaceful, certainly by Somali standards, and pretty democratic, certainly by Somali standards. Quite a lot of Somalilanders live in parts of the UK, not in my constituency as it happens. Now, there's a really interesting issue, which is how does the self-determination of those people get taken forward? They often came to me and said, we want you, as Britain, to be sponsoring independence for Somaliland. And I said to them, look, with the best will in the world, the worst thing that could happen is for us to be your campaign managers for independence, because it will arouse all the suspicions of the rest of Africa. The sad thing is, they can't get other Africans to take seriously their concerns, because the rest of Africa is very worried about what's the precedent that's set for breaking up countries. Now, one interesting point, will the creation of South Sudan change some of that dynamic? I don't know. But the truth is the Somalilanders, as part of Somalia, have got a very bleak future. As a potentially independent state, they've got something to play for.
Thanks for your question. And listen, I support you on one thing you said. I actually think there's a bipartisan consensus emerging in Washington on Iran. Most of our president and Governor Romney both have an almost identical policy. They believe Iran is rational, that you can negotiate as well as apply pressure. There's only one candidate who's essentially said that Iran is an irrational government. That's Rick Santorum. So I think there's some hope here that we might be able to fashion a sensible American policy, bipartisan on Iran. But thank you. Last question. I apologize for those who've been waiting. We only have time for one more question. It's right here.
Thank you, Nick. Isaac Diwan, I teach economics at the Kennedy School. Moving a little bit to the Arab world, to the Arab Spring, we should talk about it. It would be really interesting to hear your opinion on the causes, and you started talking a little about it. And also perhaps in the spirit of candor here, you know, you've been there, real politics and all that. Why has the West, the NATO countries, supported these autocrats? They were very repressive, anti-democratic, and all that for so long. It'd be really interesting to hear it from you, since you've been there and we can learn from you.
Isaac, thank you very much.
That's a good question. I think that for a long time, or for some time, we have given more weight in our international relations to stability than the freedom of people. Now, it's very trivial to say this, but it entails a lot of consequences, because you have to be able to govern a situation of transformation, and we know that is very difficult as we see it. That we are seeing now is a revolution in which the revolutionary people have no power. Okay? The ones who came to the street have no power now. And the ruling class is the same ruling class of the past. The Muslim brothers in Egypt have been there, even their leaders, for years and years and years, as old as Mubarak. So the youngest are the people who have disappeared from the picture. So I claim, and I say that we have played our cards probably not well, or not right, by maintaining in power for reasons of stability in a very complicated zone for too long a time, people that didn't deserve it.
The second question first. Diplomats deal with governments. And when you deal with governments, you have to deal with them almost whatever stripe they are. And sometimes remarkable things happen. I would never have believed that the Burmese government would have allowed even the limited experiments in democracy that have happened, the return of Aung San Suu Kyi. But we deal with governments. And so when we went to meet Mubarak, we dealt with him. Now, you also try and have a foreign policy that engages with people. That's why I'm sure we both would do meetings at Cairo University or go to Al-Azhar or elsewhere. But the simple truth is that you have to deal with the institutions of state power. Now, when do you cross the line between dealing with institutions of state power and supporting institutions of state power? That's essentially the difficulty. And I think the truth is that there's a very mixed record. I mean, actually, I think it was when you were at the State Department, there was this push to try, I mean, I think Condi Rice went to Cairo and said, we've been supporting tyrants for far too long, we're going to have to, we want to support the people, not just support the government. Now, what's interesting, actually, is that the revolutions or the revolts that have happened have been nothing to do with the West at all. These have been homegrown revolts against, and this is the first part of your question, against kleptocracy, corruption, inequality, but also a sense that national mission and national pride had been completely lost. I mean, I think Egypt is the most profound example of this. This is a 3,000-year-old civilization. I don't know whether you would agree with this, but my sense is that people felt the country was being led nowhere. And in the end, it became a matter of there was a personal affront and a national affront that led to this boiling over. Triggered in part by Tunisia, but what happened in Tunisia, but also by a sense that the regime was completely without morality or legitimacy, and empowered by information more than by anything else. And I think that's significant. I don't think it is 1848, the European revolutions, where one elite was replaced by another. I think it's something more than that, but it's not 1989. There's quite a lot of the old guard still finding their way back into the system, but it's happening in a different context, and that's why I think this notion that it's a radically democratic age is quite important, because the genie of open flows of information can't be put back in the bottle.
Alas, we have run out of time. It's been a remarkable opportunity to hear from two great and very thoughtful leaders. Please join me in thanking Javier Solana and David Miliband.